Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this seminar. Our speaker today is Alexandra Antoniadou. Alexandra is an alumnus of the Master in Brain and Mind series, Sciences. She graduated in 2020. Before that, Alexandra studied electrical and computer engineering in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and graduated in 2012. Her talk today is entitled Age-Related Changes of Cortical Dynamics at the Light-World Memory, which is the title of her thesis at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She started her PhD in 2024, and the floor is yours, Alexandra.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to see you all. And I'm gonna first talk about a bit of my experience in the program. Okay, so yeah, while I was studying electrical and computer engineer, I started to be very curious about the human behavior, so how we think and how emotions work and how everything is interconnected with each other. And I started studying this on my own, mainly through psychology and philosophy discipline. But then I realized that the core of this comes from the very complex brain structure, the brain, from a very complex system, the brain. So it really fascinated me also that unlike the other systems that I was studying, the computer, for the brain, there was not an explicit designer. So there wasn't a predefined step and steps in order for the brain to function. So to me, that was very huge. And I was really charmed by what is so great about the neural code. So then I started to look for a master and in Greece, and then Brain and Mind really stood out, mainly because of the interdisciplinary nature. So my opinion of the program was that in general, I think integrating knowledge from very different fields, it's very challenging for the people that design it, but also for the people that follow it. So, but I really think that the program delivered because I gained a really broad understanding of how different fields approach the brain research. And to this day, I can say that I can take part in very diverse discussions in diverse topics about the brain. And another good thing for me was that we were a class with few people, so we had the full attention of the professors. And what was very important to me was the discussions that we had inside the classroom, but also outside, because this really helped me understand and gain perspective. So I started to understand what I want to do in the future and how to approach it. And the same went for the science itself. I got the idea of how to ask the right questions and how to approach every problem. So above knowledge, I also think that I gained perspective through the program. And the other great thing about it for me was that the students, we were students from very diverse fields, and we were constantly having discussions, and we were exchanging ideas. And I think this was very valuable to me and really important for the future of the field, like the collaboration between fields. And the other important thing for me was the lab rotations that the program offered, because I joined personally very active labs, and I did real research, and also my contribution led to publication. So this was very good for me and for my future steps. And also, I think the close collaboration between the program and the institute, the fourth, helped us be exposed in the scientific community and understand how things work. So overall, I'm very satisfied and very grateful for what I gained from the program, both from the professors and from the students. And yes, I graduated in June of 2024. And then on January, sorry. And then on June, I started my PhD. So a couple of years ago with Klaus Wimmer here in Barcelona. And we are a computational unit in the Centre de Recerca Mathemàtica. And we study cognitive functions using computational models. So similarly, my project is I study working memory using computational models. And specifically, I study how working memory is impaired at the network level during healthy aging. Okay, wait, I need to see. So it's hard to talk and not see any faces. All right, so to start with some definitions, working memory is the ability to maintain information online in the absence of external input. And from different studies, we know that possibly a distributed network is employed in order for the working memory to be sustained. But studies from like lesion studies and electrophysiological studies point that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex might be a key region. So we are also gonna choose dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as a model circuit in order to study the underlying mechanisms of working memory. So what do we want to model? What is the neural signature of working memory? From a very classical study from recordings in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they found that when a subject is in active state of remembering something, then the neurons show persistent activity, sustained activity during the delay. And this activity is also correlated with performance. So this is what we want to model. This is what we consider the neural signature of working memory. But then the question is, what are the circuits, the mechanisms, and or the underlying architecture that can support this sustained activity? Okay, so from original work by Patricia Goldman-Rakis, she found that the pyramidal neurons in the layer 3 of the prefrontal cortex form horizontal connections with clusters of other pyramidal neurons. So she proposed the idea that maybe neurons with similar tuning, also inspired from B1, may form these connections with each other in order to reinforce each other's activity. And this may support and give rise to persistent activity. And so this idea also inspired computational models where this model can, persistent activity can arise in those models through recurrent excitation and structure inhibition. And we're also going to use this idea. But first, why study aging, working memory through aging? So at first, studies from human and non-human primates have shown that working memory declines with age. So age affects working memory and other cognitive abilities. And here I show you data from our collaborators in Boston, where they had monkeys of different age perform a special working memory task. And they, of course, found like decline in their performance with age, among other things. Second thing is that many of these age-related changes overlap with changes that are happening in neurodegenerative conditions that are also responsible for cognitive impairment. So, and a key question is not how working memory functions in ideal condition, but also how and when it breaks. So aging provides this natural framework to study this. But what are the changes that are happening with aging? So the collective literature points that aging causes both structural and functional changes to the neurons. So these changes include damage in the actions. Here we see an action from a very young non-human primate And here we see an aged subject where the action is damaged. It has these balloons, it has splits, and this impairs signal transmission, of course. Another factor is synapse loss. We see that aged subjects have fewer synapses. And another aging factor is hyperexcitability. So they found that in patch clamp recordings, not inside the circuit, but in patch clamp, that aged neurons have stronger responses to the same input. And all of these changes can be found in different areas, but they are very prominent, and they are in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they are also associated with cognitive decline. So we believe that those also affect the working memory as they affect the circuits. So the question that we have and what we want to do is build this model of working memory of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex circuit, and then incorporate many age-related changes in order to study their effects at the network level. These aging factors has been studied in this context with models, but there were different models and they were studied separately. So also the thing that we want to add is to have this unified framework. That means just one single model that incorporates all those changes. Okay, so first we need to figure out what kind of model we're going to use for working memory based on everything that we need to model. And this model needs to have, to be able, of course, to sustain population activity, that's the neural signature of working memory, but over behavioral relevant time scales, that's typically 5 seconds. Also a model that can produce realistic firing rates, and also a one that captures variability, because we've seen in many behavioral experiments that the responses in a working memory task are not always the same, so there's some sort of variability. And we also want it to be robust to perturbations that we are also gonna add. And all of these are naturally captured by the continuous bump attractor networks, as it has been found. So what are those? This is what we're going to use as our model. We have integrated firing neurons. So this is a spiking neural network. And those neurons are connected according to the preferred location in a ring connectivity. That means that every neuron in our network is going to have preferred Q in this angle in this circle. And it's going to be where in this angle a special stimulus might appear. And the ring connectivity actually means that the nearby neurons reinforce each other, and they have stronger connections to nearby neurons compared to more distant ones. So also a network has inhibition. Inhibition is recruited through the excitatory neurons, but it has a broader range. So it creates this Mexican hat-like connectivity that gives rise to localized activity that we call bump or memory bump. So here the position of this bump is reflects the remembered value in the circle. Here is the degrees. It means the point in the circle. And we see that the memory is stored across population in those types of networks. And as I said before, we also want to capture variability. So we don't want each time when we present a stimulus to the network to have the exact same response. We need this variability. So to add this, we add noise. And we add noise by having a disrupted connectivity. So it's not a symmetric network. Not all networks, neurons are connected to each other equally. So this gives rise to noise fluctuations, and we can have variability. But in order not to produce a network, not to produce very large drifts of the memory, we add short-term facilitation and depression, making the network even more realistic. And this has been shown that you can obtain back sustained activity in the behavioral relevant time scales. So this is our network. Now the question is how we can model age-related changes that were cellular and morphological in a network that doesn't explicitly have this kind of biological detail. So first, I like to mention that so far I have modeled demyelination and hyperexcitability. So first we start with demyelination, and we consider these. We start from the single neuron, and we consider this very detailed morphologically and biophysically single neuron that all of the actions are explicitly modeled by different segments, axonal segments, and each of these segments has its own myelin and its own dynamics. So this is not my work, this is from our collaborators. And what they did is that they created different cases of demyelination by removing different percentages of these lamella. So they make different cases of progression of demyelination, and also by changing this, by introducing this damage at different percentages of the axonal segments. And then they simulated the signal action potential propagation, and they found this graded failure of signal transmission probability. That means with more severe demyelination reflected in the number of actions that are damaged and how much they are damaged, the signal transmission is impaired, the probability is reduced. So how we will transfer this to the network level. So what we do is just we apply this explicit threshold to our neurons in order not to fire, not to spike more than the corresponding probability that it was found in this corresponding demyelination case. So it's like more an explicit modeling. We apply this threshold to our network. And then in contrast, for hyperexcitability, the other factor, the aging factor that we're gonna model, we rely on the PATS Club recordings from our collaborators, where they measured different monkeys with different age, and they also replicated the finding that aged neurons have stronger responses to the same input. So we also want to have this in our model. So to capture this, we took the equation that similarly gives the FY curve from our integrated firing neuron, and we tune the parameters that are responsible for changing the frequency. And we change them in a way that is in line with experimental measurements on those same properties. So here the change is more intrinsic. And we were able to capture this shift in the FY curve. So we have 3 groups of neurons with parameters that correspond to the control case, let's say, and then parameters that correspond to the middle or low excitability, and the one that corresponds to the old monkeys or high hyperexcitability. So, I hope it's not too heavy. To sum up, we have this model that it's supposed to model the circuit of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in a way that it can give rise to persistent activity. And we want to model age-related changes to that. And so far we have demyelination and hyperexcitability. So what we want to see and examine is the changes in the dynamics, so at the network level. So for that, we rely on the classical delayed response task, where after a fixation, a cue is presented to the subject, and then it's removed. And after a delay period, he needs to remember it and have this information online, and then produce an action. So similarly, here is a trial from our control network that corresponds to the young case, let's say, where we present a stimulus in the circle. We have 8 different positions, and we see the response. Here, the activity is aligned to the delay onset, We present the stimulus for 1 second, and then we remove it, and we see the activity during the delay period. And here the neurons are indexed according to the preferred location in the circle. And this plot gives you the average firing rate of each neuron. So in general, in order to study this, we don't just want to see if the memory is there or it's absent. We also want to get an idea of the changes in the dynamics. And we do that through the properties of the bump. So we measure the bump amplitude, which reflects like the average firing rate levels of the network. This is an average during delay, and also its width, which like gives you an idea of how broad the memory is spread, distributed across the neurons. So this corresponds to the control case, and then we see how this is changed by adding the different perturbations. And first, with hyperexcitability, the first thing we see is that there is a change in the structure of the activity. So you can see that the width is more broad. That means that more neurons are recruited as a response to the same stimulus. So it seems that the network becomes less precise. And then if we average over like all trials and many different network configurations, we get the same thing, but it's more robust as a result. We see here's the bump width, that excitability increases the bump width. But surprisingly, the firing rate level stays more or less the same, which is not trivial because these networks have neurons that respond more. So they produce more firing rates to begin with. But for some reason, at the network level, this doesn't translate to having more firing rates. So what hyperexcitability does is that it like reduces the precision. It makes selective neurons less selective. And here I calculated these metrics at the start of the delay and then at the end in order to see if there are changes throughout time. And we see that the metrics stay more or less the same. So that means that there is a strong memory trace throughout time. This is not changing. The firing rate levels are high, but we see this change in the spread. And now, in order to see if this has an effect on the memory stability, we calculate two different measures that are associated with variability: the diffusion, that shows the trial-to-trial variability, and the drift, which is the deviation of the remembered stimulus, the deviation from the original remembered stimulus. And we see that, at least with high hyperexcitability, there is a slight increase in those metrics. So that indicates that memory is less reliable. And now, in order to capture these changes in the dynamics with a single metric, we calculate the first Fourier mode. This is the normalized vector sum of the firing rates of the neurons. And it basically takes values from 0, which means no memory bump, and to 1, which means like a very well localized bump with high firing rates and very narrow tuning. So we see that, like as a sum up, that with increasing hyperexcitability, this memory strength goes down as expected because the memory is broadening. And overall, we could say that hyperexcitability decreases memory stability by decreasing precision, but not duration. Then we move on to the demyelination. We consider different cases that correspond to different percentages of axonal segments that they have the damage, the demyelination, and 3 different cases of progression of this damage. So they have the full lamina, or they don't have the lamina at all. And here is an example trial from one of these cases. And the first thing we see is that now the memory trace is lost after some point. And this time point correlates with when the memory strength falls below 0.4. So this plot here is a bit dense. It has all the 9 cases together. The x-axis has the number of lamina removed, so the progression of the myelin. The more right, the more severe. And then the different colors are the different percentage of action that is affected. But I suggest to just look at this axis as it has the most effect. And by looking at this, we can find 3 different cases, like mild demyelination cases where the memory is starts strongly, I would say, like the metric is close to, it's high. And then after 5 seconds, it's still there. So the memory is not lost throughout time. But then we have these middle cases where the memory starts strongly, I would say, but then at the end, it's lost. So it's something like this. The memory cannot hold for the whole delay period with demyelination. And we have the very severe cases where there is no memory to begin with. So what is happening to the dynamics? And we have this. First, we see that in contrast with hyperexcitability, that now there is a big change in the firing rates. So what is compromised with demyelination is the firing rates. And in contrast, the bandwidth or the selectivity of the neurons of the memory stays more or less the same. And it's actually at the control levels that we saw before. It only drops in those cases where, as we saw before, the memory was not there to begin with. So we say that demyelination primarily impacts working memory duration. And again, to sum up, we found differential effects of these 2 aging factors. They both impair working memory, but in different ways. So with hyperexcitability, it seems that memory lasts, but it's less precise. And with demyelination, memory is precise, but it doesn't last. So the natural question now is, what happens if we combine these changes? And again, we want to capture changes in the dynamics reflected in the properties of the bumps. So now we have all the demyelination cases as before, but now I have indexed them with numbers depending on the severity. So the more right, it's the more severe, and reflecting the memory, the duration of the memory. So like the most severe cases, they don't have memory at all. And with purple, it's the combination of all these demyelination cases with low hyperexcitability, and with red, it's the high. Yes. And what we found was that there is a compensation that it's non-linear. So for example, if we take the firing rate levels, the bump amplitude, we see the purple first, a little bit of hyperexcitability was able to restore the once very low firing rates. But this is not the case for all the demyelination levels. Then if we add a bit more hyperexcitability and we go to the red curve, we can see that now all the firing rates are restored. But at the same time, we also need to look the width, so to get the full picture of the dynamics. And we see that by adding this very high excitability, now the width is also like becomes very big, and it's even greater than the control levels. So to have the generic idea, again, we go to the memory strength because it captures also both cases, amplitude and width. And we see that indeed, when we add the high hyperexcitability, all cases are restored. So there is memory because it's over 0.5, but it's a low value. So that makes us think that maybe the quality of the dynamics, it's not very good in order to have a memory representation. So this was for a lot of time the conclusion that we got from modeling these 2 factors. But then I started thinking that if this is true, so the question now is, are changes in the dynamics necessarily translate to changes in the functionality of the network? So for this, I performed a decoding analysis and we asked whether the stimulus position could be reconstructed from the activity, from the population activity. And so first, surprisingly, even though we saw that the precision of the network goes down with hyperexcitability, the decoding is not compromised much. Like there is only a slight decrease. And in contrast, the myelination accuracy drops, like for all levels, very drastically. So then again, now we combine the two factors. Here we have the demyelination, but with low hyperexcitability and high. And we saw that hyperexcitability seems to be a compensatory mechanism because it really pushed all the decoding accuracies in high levels again, even though all of these cases have very different dynamics, as we saw before. Some of them may have like very low firing rates, but very wide tuning, or more narrow tuning, but very high, or even low firing rates. So many different cases in the dynamics didn't necessarily translate to different levels of readout. So then to investigate this a bit more, we consider the balance between excitation and inhibition input to the synapses. And first we see that in the case of hyperexcitability, the EI ratio is increasing. And if we see the individuals, we see that the excitation has a higher gain. So this is what hyperexcitability drives more the excitatory inputs. And in contrast, we see the opposite in demyelination. So we see that it reduces the effective inhibition and excitation, but overall inhibition is dominant because the EI ratio also drops. So now if we put these two together, these opposing effects, we see that they were able to create a balance between excitation and inhibition for all these different cases. And so maybe this provides this mechanistic explanation about the robustness of the decoder. So that may hint that the balance between EI, excitation and inhibition, drives the network into a more functional point. So overall, our analysis seems to point that hyperexcitability acts as a compensatory mechanism, and what really drives the functionality, it's not the firing rates or the tuning per se, but the balance between excitation and inhibition. And so far, we try to see how aging affects the dynamics of the circuit, but now we also want to know if there are any changes that are happening in the more behavioral level. So we introduced distractors because also in ideal conditions, the memory cannot, needs to be robust in interference also. So from the literature, we see that a distractor may have different effects on the memory. It can cause like reduced precision. We do not really remember what was the original stimulus, or in some cases, it can completely override the original memory and we just remember the last thing that we saw. So we asked if we add an distractor in the network, how the network is gonna maintain the original presentation. And we consider adding the distractor at different locations compared to the original stimulus and at different time points. And then we measure the drift, so like the shift that the network has in the presence of a distractor. Here we see just an overview, again, a single trial. Our control network, when we introduce a distractor, it's able to filter out this distractor, but we tune it that way. But then when we add the perturbations, we see that in the case of hyperexcitability, the distractor causes the activity to spread. So it creates more or less like an average representation between the original stimulus and the distractor, of course, because it's also nearby. And we see that the case in the case of demyelination, it overrides the memory. So we calculated the drift and measured it systematically for all different locations of the distractor. And first thing we see is that hyperexcitability reduces the filtering ability of the network in the presence of distractor, because we see that the drift is increasing. And this effect is more prominent to nearby distractors that are nearby in space, but also in time. So they produce a larger drift in the case where the distractor is close to the stimulus, the original stimulus. And then we see the opposite for the demyelination network, demyelinated networks, where again, the demyelination reduces the ability of the network to filter, but this is more prominent when distractors are further away, spatially and in time. So again, we find that these aging factors impair the filtering of the distractor, but they do it in different ways. And now we are at the point of adding the two factors together in order to see if there is compensation in distractor filtering as well, or distractor filtering is happening through different mechanisms, maybe, compared to the holding the memory. So yeah, the first conclusion is that our model predicts that biologically plausible levels of myelin loss and hyperexcitability account for working memory impairment, but with different ways. Hyperexcitability impairs the memory precision, but myelin loss impairs the memory duration. And we saw that a combination of demyelination and hyperexcitability restores the effect. So maybe hyperexcitability acts like as a compensatory mechanism. And it seems that the important thing for this effect to happen is the EI balance. And we also found differential effects of distractors between hyperexcitability and demyelinated networks. Now, as future steps, we want to have a more detailed model and incorporate different cell types in order to see how they contribute to working memory and how they are differentially affected by age. Then also develop some more analytical approximations of how excitation and inhibition interacted and gave those results. And also currently we are scaling up our model to incorporate more areas and study also distributed networks of working memory. And finally, we also need to add synapse loss in order to study all the aging factors together. So with that, I want to thank my lab for the guidance and the support. And also I'd like to mention that this is a project that it's funded by Marie Curie. We are all PhD students under the umbrella of doing research in mental health. And we all come from very different backgrounds, and our PhD subjects are very different, but it's very nice and very fun. And thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions or feedback.